Okay, should we get started? Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Jaron, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the UC Berkeley. Today's event is part of the Culture in Contemporary Life series initiated by the American Sociological Association section on cultural sociology. The purpose of this series is to explore pressing issues of our time through the cultural lens. I wanted to thank my committee members, Amin Gazinaani, Ali Piazza, Rachel Kington, Ian Waller, and Xiaohong Xu. So today we're going to discuss fake news. As a moderator, I will start with 4 questions for our 3 distinguished panelists. Then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. To participate, you could post your questions and comments in the Q&A section on Zoom anytime, but please do not use the chat room. We will post each panelist a different work and highlight them in the chat room. Okay, so as the second panel of the year, I'm very honored to be around a panel of stellar scholars. So Dr. Francesca Tripodi is a sociologist and media scholar whose research examines the relationship between social media, political partisanship, and digital inequality. She's an assistant professor at the School of Information and Library Science and a senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the UNC Chapel Hill. Her upcoming book is with Yale University Press titled The Propagandist Playbook. She, as a co-PI, received an ASF Accelerator grant to better understand how cultural contexts shape search literacy practices. Dr. Gary Allan is a James Johnson Professor of Sociology at Northwestern University. He was a recipient of many awards, including a Ganahill Fellowship. He has written extensively on rumor and reputation for the past half-century. He's a co-author of Rumor and Gossip, the Social Psychology of Hearsay, Whispers on the Color Line, Rumor and Race in America, The Global Grapevine, Why Rumors of Terrorism, Immigration, and Trade Matter. Dr. Jaron Harabam is Assistant Professor of Participatory AI at Athena Institute of, I'm probably saying it wrong. Let me try. Vrije University Amsterdam, the Netherlands. His research deals with conspiracy theories, news, and platform politics, and AI, especially in terms of content moderation, search recommender systems. His book, Contemporary Conspiracy Culture, Truth and Knowledge in an Era of Epistemic Instability, is out right now. He's editor-in-chief of the open access of Dutch-Belgian peer-reviewed journal. I'm not going to try this. I'm going to post it in the chat room. And a member of the European network of scholars working on conspiracy theories, Cause the Compact. Okay, so let me start by going around the room with the first question. Okay, so since we're talking about fake news, so what is fake news? And who gets to do it, and who gets to determine something as fake versus true? Francesca, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. So I think before we even get into the power dynamic of news and information, we can think a little bit more about how even the phrase itself, fake news, has been weaponized for political gain. And so there are some really great scholars in other fields, and I'm happy to put some in some chats, that delineate between the difference between things like misinformation, disinformation, problematic content, and the concept of fake news. But related specifically to this question, I think it all boils down to who controls the power to determine what constitutes reality and fiction. And when it comes to informational settings, we saw this happen during the last presidential administration with respects to how the phrase itself got co-opted, right? So the concept was initially created by journalists to describe how narratives coming out of the White House were incorrect. But then the White House co-opted this phrase and then used it against mainstream journalism to refer to any kind of press that was negative towards the president. So the phrase itself is like particularly contentious. And I think that's why many scholars within the field have begun to co-opt different ways of thinking about problematic content, and why and how we can potentially combat it. But I think, especially talking about different platforms and content moderation, I'll defer to the other scholars on the panel for now. Oh, you're muted.
Yes. Okay, great. Next is Jaron. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree very much with Francesca, and it's a very complicated issue, especially when you're a scholar studying these topics. So my field is more so to give a different comparative perspective. In Europe as well, the fake news term has been quite fastly discarded as a very useless term to describe problematic content, especially since it's so easily weaponized, and it was such a big empty container that everybody can use and adapt to signify many different things. But I think the more central sociological question is, of course, indeed, who gets to define what is problematic content, what are conspiracy theories, what are not. And the difficulty with that is like something that, well, became very apparent, I think, also during the corona pandemic. So to give one telling example, for example, in my research on conspiracy theories was the statement of a number of respected virologists and other top scientists early February 2020 to signify rumors or allegations or concerns that the coronavirus could have escaped from the laboratory of the Wuhan Institute of Virology as conspiracy theories. And since then, this notion, this concern, got tainted very much. So it was very much taken up by mainstream media, politicians, platforms as well, as something that is indeed flawed, irrational, paranoid, crazy, dangerous, xenophobic, etc. And the example is so interesting because over time, this has very much changed. So it took half a year until Washington Post journalists started to report about the possibility that there could be actually a lab leak happening, that the virus could have actually escaped from that. And over the half year after that, even after the WHO published their initial report on these allegations, where they indicated that it was highly unlikely, the official American administration of Biden started to also explore this possibility. So the whole plausibility of this notion of what was allegedly fake news before became a real possibility later. So I think as a cultural sociologist, this poses, these are very fascinating dynamics to explore and to study and to see how, to study the definitional power of different actors in society. And especially the change over time, I think, is very relevant. So who gets to decide what is fake news and what is not is the excellent research topic for a cultural sociologist, I would say.
Great. So Gary, what's your take?
All right. Well, I think we've all agreed that the term fake news is a problematic term, so we can end our discussion, but we better not. For me, what we're dealing with as a scholar who has addressed rumors for half a century is that we're looking at a set of truth claims. They're propositions that are made by people who have particular interests and particular resources within various kinds of social spaces. They may be local social spaces, they may be the public square, they may be media spaces. What I am particularly interested in is what I call the politics of plausibility in terms of judging truth claims. Does this material seem plausible to particular kinds of audiences? So to a Trump base, certain kinds of claims seem inherently plausible. To others who are affiliated with different groups, they seem implausible. So you have the politics of plausibility, and then that connects to what I speak of, have written about, of the politics of credibility. And that has to do with who is providing that information. And again, you have different judgments of who is plausible. Now, we may get into this later in the panel. I'm doing some work with the Swedish government with their crisis communication office. And in doing that, we have to look at how governments can insert themselves in moments of crisis in ways that are productive, in looking at, is the government seen as credible and is the claim seen as plausible, whatever the truth value may be.
Okay, so it seems like everybody agrees fake news is a very problematic term. But I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about how is fake news now becoming a real phenomenon? Or do you think this is more of a constructed label as a rhetoric weapon in all kinds of information warfare? Let's see, this time let's start with Jaron.
Yeah, this is a very good question, of course, and I think it is, of course, both. So you see, on the one hand, that that information wars are more all over the place. We see this with the war in Ukraine at the moment, but the Corona crisis was another telling example, and then you go back to the American presidential elections, etc. So to manipulate the crowds or to steer them in certain way is part of everyday politics nowadays, you would say. So the hybrid warfare is not just something that happens between the East and the West, but is also in national context very present. And of course, the sort of the affordances and what the internet brought about is very much a democratization of knowledge, but on the other hand also, yeah, a new information landscape that is much more complex than before. So the traditional gatekeepers of legitimate information lost their powerful position to many different other actors in society, including social media platforms that work by very different norms and values as mainstream media would have. So there is indeed much more, many more different actors, I would say, that can produce knowledge over the internet, and they have more or less of a reputation of credibility of different people. But I think the possibilities to steer and manipulate different segments of societies have become much more open and much more open to many different actors to manipulate. So it's a much more chaotic environment, for sure. So definitely it is a social problem in a way, but also very much of a moral panic about it as well. And at last, I think it's definitely clear how it's been used as a weapon in rhetorical warfare.
So Francesca, what do you think?
I'm throwing out all my preparatory comments right now, so sorry. Sometimes I'm like typing as I'm hearing other people speak. I think right now, whether or not the concept of fake news is real is less important than how people seek out information in today's society. So thinking more about the socio-technical aspects of how information is accessible and kind of drawing together what Jaron and Gary were mentioning. I think a lot in my research about how cultural context shape the way we interact with what we think of information, and also it very much influences the kind of information we seek out. And so the way that the internet is created, it's possible to confirm almost any reality you want. And so something I think about in my book, you know, we think about things like the color of the sky, and we tend to think of the sky as blue as this universal concept. But if you go to Google, you know, you can type in the sky is green, or the sky is red, or the sky is purple. And the way that search engines are programmed, right, in terms of like keywords and inputs, will very much shape the kinds of returns that are spit back to you. And so that in turn shapes your reality. So I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but I think in terms of whether or not, you know, the phrase itself, fake news, I think is very, very real, especially when you're looking at it in connection to Trump supporters. And you see this in a lot of the political rallies that are happening. This phrase is still very much used. And I think it's important for us to recognize the context in which it's used. But in terms of like our cultural sociology hat and researchers, it's less useful, and rather it's more thinking about how information flows are impacted by our cultural understanding of the world to begin with.
I see. So in many ways, it depends on how the reality or the real phenomenon is constructed and shaped by different.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think like if you're studying the concept of fake news, the phrase itself, you know, I mean, there's 1,000 different ways you can think about that research question. But for those who are attending political rallies right now, leading up to the next 2 election cycles, this concept, fake news, is still very, very much a reality. And you see it, you know, in content moderation discussions on like reopen groups that I was studying on Facebook. The concept of fake news is still very much a reality for some groups. But if you're asking the question in terms of like scholastically, how do we as cultural sociologists examine the phenomenon of fake news, I don't think that concept itself is what is useful to us, but rather the broader interaction.
Yeah. So I see, Gary, you're willing to jump on.
Right. Well, I really like what Francesca was saying, because there is this interesting divide between, you know, the question of what is true, that is, what is fake news in one sense, but how is fake news as a political concept used? And it reminds me of research by very fine urban folklorist Veronique Campion-Vincent, who talks about one of the things that has happened with contemporary legends, urban legends they're sometimes called, is that they are increasingly focused on elites. That elites are the targets of, you know, who is committing these conspiracies, these atrocities. And because there are so many different segmented elites, you can have both people on the left and on the right, or centrists, thinking about different elites, entirely different elites. You know, it is a way of saying that facts are promiscuous. You know, that there's so many out there and doing a variety of different things. Early in my career, I wrote some material on the Kennedy assassination. And one of my bookshelves back there, I have a set of maybe a dozen different books that claim that John Kennedy, JFK, was killed by Texas oilmen, by Lyndon Johnson, by the communists, by the Cubans, by organized crime, and so on and so forth. So we shouldn't think that the issue of what is going on, what is really true out there, is an entirely new issue. We can, you know, bring that back in history. The difference, however, is the different media environments. So it used to be the case that, you know, in New York City, there would be 10 daily newspapers. Now there are 3. In Chicago, there used to be half a dozen. Now we have 2. Many cities have a single newspaper owned by a single corporation. And so that is the institutional divisions of knowledge production have diminished in terms of the press, but other areas, other domains, such as on the internet, social media and podcasts and so forth, have expanded enormously. So it is one reason that we can say, if we want to say the sky is blue, parenthetically, it's gray here in Chicago, but we won't get into that. But we can see people who might argue that it's green or red or purple and so forth.
Okay, so just following on that, so I'm wondering, in your opinion, what is the biggest misconception about fake news, either in public discussion or scholarly work? Gary, would you like to continue since you already mentioned?
Well, okay, well, I mean, the biggest misconception is, I think, something that maybe the three of us were getting at, that, the issue of what is really real, truly true, may not be the most important issue for sociologists to consider. It's not something that we would know about. So that most of the things that we hear are mediated in a secondary way. That what is happening in the Ukraine, in a sense, I have no idea in terms of my eyes. I have many ideas in terms of my ears. That is, I hear things, or I read things, but I know very little about what is going on. And then we get into a topic, a phrase that we haven't talked about, and that is trust. And how is institutional trust developed? Who are we going to believe because of all of these voices that Francesca, for instance, has mentioned? And I think that is our challenge, to think as theorists rather than as people who want to tell the public what the empirical truth of the world is.
So Jaron, what's your take on this?
I think the biggest misconception perhaps on fake news is the idea that we can get rid of this problem by debunking fake news. So I think what all of us are trying to show as well is that the cultural worldview that people have and the social circles in which people are living in very much determine these questions of trust, of plausibility, of credibility, etc. So there's so much efforts also in the European context of EU money going to these sort of projects of media skills, debunking, fact checkers, etc. And while they do important work, and I think it's very important that we teach our youngsters how to differentiate different qualities of information and to assess that. It's a very sort of, rather narrow idea of how people interpret information, as if it's merely a cognitive issue that can be supplemented with the right information, and that ignores sort of the social and cultural context, which are super important in terms of assessing the credibility. And also what you see with a lot of, in the US context, with a lot of Trump supporters, is that they may, so the famous example, of course, was this inauguration where the field was quite kind of empty. Everybody could see it. Yet still many Trump supporters would say that, no, it's not true. There were many, many people. So it shows that the truth of the matter was not as important as showing allegiance to a certain candidate or a certain social or political group. Debunking is just like a very small part of getting rid of the problem.
So what do you think, Francesca?
Okay, so I think we have a lot of really important discussions happening at the same time. I'm definitely going to echo the other panelists. It's not the fact itself or debunking it. I think the largest misconception that we don't consider is the role audiences play in constructing their own misinformation bubbles. And I think, Gary's work on conspiracy Gary, I'd love if you could post, I know a couple of people have asked this, the link to the elites and urban legends researcher that you just quoted. I'd love to read that. But something I talk a lot about in my work is that people who are spreading problematic content are challenging audiences to go out there and do their own research themselves, right? So they're saying, don't believe what I have to say. And this very much activates, especially in the United States, the Protestant ethic of individualism, and this idea that I'm not going to listen to some elite tell me what to think, even if I am actually part of the elite. So people are much more inclined to believe false information when they are part of this constructed process, right? So I think when we're thinking about like fact checking or debunking, we're conceptualizing information only as though somebody reads it and then believes it, which we all know that's not, I mean, that's like Lazarus salts and cats, right? Basic, we've been as sociologists not thinking about information like that for so long. And so for us, right, what we need to think about is how sophisticated conspiracy theorists and propagandists are, and that they aren't just saying like, here's the bad content. I like to think of it, it's like, I call it the IKEA effect of misinformation. So people are much more inclined to value their IKEA furniture because they put it together themselves. And we're seeing the same phenomenon happening with misinformation, where people see the internet with problematic content and they know how to tag this information, and then they're saying, but don't believe me, Google it, do your own research and look up, you know, the assassination, look up the grassy knoll, right? If we're thinking about how it would work in today's context. And so people go out there and they look up these concepts that have been preceded in the internet. And then the way search engine optimization works, the stuff rises to the top and it confirms this concept, like, oh my gosh. And now, because people have been involved in this narrative process, they value it more, right? They're much less likely to believe somebody saying, no, that's not true, because they've done the work on their own and built the narrative themselves.
Okay, excellent. I think actually, I think all of you have touched on this question, but for the purpose of the panel, I'm wondering, so how do you see that, how can cultural sociologists contribute to this discussion? Because right now I think it's more of a communication scholars, or, you know, people who do big data and computational social sciences, they're occupying this space. So I'm wondering if you could offer some wisdom on what we can do as cultural sociologists. Let's start with Jaron.
Yeah, okay. So I think one of the biggest things that we as cultural sociologists can do is also to study, first of all, I think also the moral panic around it. So you see a lot of work on misinformation, this conspiracy theories, fake news, etc. is very, it has a very strong moral bent in it. And that sort of influences very much the research as well. It's a very normative endeavor, and this, I think, is rather problematic. And from a cultural sociological perspective, you move away from the truth of the matter, but also maybe of the morality of the matter. And these both concepts become study objects, right? So how also scholars contribute to the understanding of fake news as something bad, as something dangerous, how that's being used. But secondly, I think what is very important as cultural sociologists is to show that information processing and beliefs are cultural mechanisms, not just psychological mechanisms. So you see a lot of research that takes very sort of cognitive assumptions into it and leave out the cultural and sociological context. So what you see with a lot of these truth wars are issues that are underlying. So a lot of these truth wars are actually paradoxically or ironically not about the truth at all, but are more about cultural conflict, value conflicts, etc. And I think as cultural sociologists, we can lay bare these more normative and value dimensions that are at stake in these information wars.
Great. So Gary, what's your take?
All right. Well, first of all, I am so impressed that there are approximately 100 participants that I almost consider that to be an example of fake news. But I think it's probably, well, whatever, whether people, I'm grateful for everyone to be here. I think that there's a lot that can be learned by our going back and looking at our classic social theorists. And in particular, you know, I teach collective memory, seminar on collective memory, and I always focus on the two great early 20th century theorists of collective memory and in some sense of fake news, and that is Maurice Halbach's and Karl Mannheim. And what Halbwachs is arguing, among many other things, is the importance of social frameworks. And so that the way that we interpret the reality that we are presented with from our colleagues and from observing and from reading and so forth has to do with those frameworks that seemed to us to be reasonable in terms of our backgrounds, in terms of our habitus, if we want to be Bourdieusian about it, and in terms of the experiences that we've had and the expectations that we've had. And then Karl Mannheim, the great Hungarian sociologist, the sociologist of knowledge, would talk about generations. But for Mannheim, the issue of generations is not simply when you were born, but the conditions under which you grew up. That is, the organizational elements that you were exposed to, the role of the state, the cultures of the particular periods, and how that affects generations. And we see that today in terms of what people at different ages think is plausible. So we had, the ages, and then also we have, political perspectives, where you stand in terms of elite institutions, for example, and that gets us into explaining why certain Americans will find a certain set of claims to be plausible, a certain set of communicators to be credible, and others have very different perspectives.
Okay, so Francesca, what do you think?
I have two things I want to build on. I mean, I think Gary's absolutely correct. We have to recognize that a lot of the things we're talking about are not new. And I think it's pretty incredible, actually. Dubois, one of articles from 1934, and I'm happy to post it. He uses the phrase, he talks about the propaganda of history, and on page 714, I think I can put it in here, he uses the phrase misinformation. And he's talking explicitly about the way white people have spread misinformation as a way of maintaining white supremacy in the United States, and so I think it's absolutely essential that we think about the way information is tied to power, kind of thinking about our very first question, and how misinformation has been around for decades and decades as a concept that isn't even ours or mine, right? Like ours is us in this collective. So since the 1930s, he's been thinking about these concepts and the way that power is constructed in the United States is laid upon, bad information about intellect or dehumanizing persons. And that's rooted in misinformation. And so I think Gary's absolutely correct in that we have to go back and read who came before us in order for us to make really important contributions as cultural sociologists. The other thing I think I'd just like to mention is, I think sometimes it's easy, and I'm an ethnographer, I definitely am biased when it comes to qualitative research. And I think qualitative research, when we're trying to understand the cultural nuances of fake news, is essential. But I think there's also, a whole field of data scientists out there that have incredible ability to pull large data sets. And what I've found in my engagement with data scientists is that they don't know what kinds of questions to ask, right, that are sociological. And that's something that we've learned, is how to ask really great questions. And so in my experience, I found that partnering with data scientists have allowed me to explore aspects of cultural sociology that wouldn't be possible as an ethnographic researcher, but has really made my work, I think, better, because I've been able to pull large data sets. And I don't know how to use R, right? But there's a lot of really talented people that do. And so I found that instead of me trying to kind of makeshift my way through data science, I can partner with really amazing data scientists who then pull these really rich sets that I can then analyze from a cultural sociological perspective. And then last thing, I cannot believe how many amazing people are on this call. I keep seeing these attendees, and it's like very humbling as a junior scholar to be part of this conversation. So it's very exciting for me to be here.
Well, it's humbling as a senior scholar as well.
That's good to know. It never gets unhumbling.
That's great. One of the major purpose of the series is to bring senior and junior scholars together from all over the world. Okay, so I think now it's probably time for us to turn to questions that many audience have posted. So there is a line of questions around, actually built on David Gibson's questions. So let me start there. So he asked, should we assume that people believe what they say they believe? There was an interesting article on Q9 arguing that Q9 belief system is very game-like, encouraging people to seek patterns and clues. An implication is that some adherents would pretend to believe because it's fun to do so. So what do we as sociologists do with that? And there are also other two questions related to that. I'm just gonna ask them all together and you can pick and choose how you wanna respond to them. So then another question is there a demonstrative or signaling aspect to fake news? And maybe the key issue is less whether I believe this or that item of information, but what does it say about me that I put my trust in it? Another audience said, does it matter if folks believe their own claims making? Should we care if the narrative is embraced as reality or merely that it's in the circulation so that architecture of legitimation can be built around it? I know it's a lot, so please just pick and choose. Anybody, please.
Well, I can begin with the question of do people believe fake news, and obviously there's a wide variety, but there's a sense in which when I think about the more extreme claims, that there's a game-like quality to it. The QAnon, it carries over into politics, but there's also this fun aspect of trying to figure out this puzzle that is being put for you, and conspiracies, I think, and particularly the more elaborate extreme ones, have that quality. I remember back in the 1960s, there was this discussion about Paul McCartney. Is Paul McCartney dead? And there were, there would be these cues or clues that you could use, that, you read the cover of the Abbey Road album and there were all of these clues that were there, or you could put the record, the LP, underwater and the green apple would turn red, and that was an indication that McCartney was dead. Whether it was play on the part of the Beatles, whether it was play on someone else's part. I remember you would play the music backwards and it would say, "We buried Paul." And I think often, not always, some of this politics is very serious, but there's also this sense of a building of community. And that connects to the person who asked the question about signaling. It suggests if you believe it and you claim it, that you're part of a particular community. And if you claim it in the wrong space, you get all kinds of Twitter feedback and Facebook feedback.
So Jaron, okay.
So I think it's very important indeed also to emphasize the fun aspect of conspiracy theorizing. You saw that especially with different topics, for example, with the Area 51, the UFO raid, that was like a whole internet hype 2 years ago. So I think these effective dimensions of conspiracy thinking are important and very much understudied as well. You see it, most of the research done is very much from a moral perspective about a social problem that we have, and these more playful engagements with information are like less studied. Not to mention, or not to say that there are no serious issues or political dangers with a lot of conspiracy theories, especially QAnon. You've all been witness of that. But I think the question of belief is particularly interesting from a cultural sociological perspective, especially if we go to religious studies and religious sociology or sociology of religion, that this whole concept of belief is very much problematized. So even if you ask religious people, do you believe in God? What does it mean if they say yes? So I think the matter of what does it mean if people say, yes, I believe in these or these conspiracy theories, are worthy of more exploration, of not just, okay, they say I agree with the contents of it, but especially also like what Gary said, that it's part of signaling who you are part of, where you stand for, or what you stand for. So I think the whole concept of believing in conspiracy theories or believing in fake news is very problematic. And you see that also translated into big data research, where a lot of assumptions are being made on the fact of sharing or retweeting certain forms of information, as if retweeting is endorsing or believing in. And you can retweet for many different reasons. So exploring these reasons and motivations and meanings of sharing certain kinds of problematic information or contentious information is, I think, exactly what Francesca was alluding to, the importance of working together with data scientists to minimize this sort of technological simplicity that is often there.
I think the only thing I'd like to add to this is that we see how conspiracy theorists play on the technological platforms of their time, right? So if we think about how the Beatles album, you would put it underwater and it would turn red, and that was confirmation. This interaction or engagement with something as way of validating belief systems is something we see happening through technological affordances. And so in a way, I think the reason why we're seeing misinformation reach kind of an infodemic, or however they're referring to it, right, is like critical space, is that because we are so interconnected through these various platforms, and then conspiracy theorists utilize these platforms to spread false content, we just see the scope and spread of it happening at a larger scale. So that's all I would add to that.
Right. So that in my area of rumor, rumor is a truth claim, but it's not necessarily a false claim. It is a claim that is unverified. Then that raises that important question of what is verification? Who has the power to verify a claim? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just think what's brilliant about what you're saying, right, is that what a lot of these technologies provide to audiences is that power. And so something I'm thinking through in these media manipulation affordance paper that I'm working on is how these conspiracy theorists have given that power to those who they want it to believe in. So an example I use is on Twitter. The creator of The Federalist put a tweet out, and they said, big tech silencing conservatism because I can't hashtag 1984. And so he put this out, they're silencing my ability to hashtag 1984. And so everyone retweeted his tweet and tried to hashtag 1984, and they couldn't. And so then that gave further evidence to this conspiracy that big tech is silencing conservatism. But Twitter as an affordance doesn't allow you to hashtag any series of numbers. It requires an alpha character. And so they were utilizing this affordance to prove this point. So people could say, look, big tech silencing conservatism, hashtag 1984. Oh my God, it's so Orwellian, I can't even hashtag it. Right. But then when people tried to do it, right, they all said, oh my gosh, because that can't be real, right? Yeah. And then they hashtag 1984. Right. Well, it validates that claim. It validates that truth claim. And in fact, that is true. You cannot hashtag 1984. Now you could spell it out and hashtag it. But so what's so what I think is so brilliant about conspiracy theorists in the information environment we're living in is that they are co-opting and utilizing these affordances to validate these truth claims in really important ways. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just thought, I was like,
No,
oh my
no,
gosh,
I think it's fascinating that, George Orwell is a sturdy English socialist, should be taken as the exemplar of American conservatism. I'm sure if there are graves up in heaven, he will be spinning in his. But
Sure.
the point is, I think, very well taken, that it depends very much on the affordances. When the claim was made that the Roosevelt administration was aware of Pearl Harbor, knew of it in advance, or even provoked it. And sure sounds a lot like 9/11 conspiracy theorists. It would be spread in that case through a number of small newsletters, small newspapers. It's a function of the media environment at that particular time.
Okay, so that actually goes very well. Goes very well with another two questions actually the audience posed. I'm very sorry that we won't have time to address all the questions. So please, for people in the audience, please contact our panelists later or read their works. Okay, so there are a couple of questions. I'm gonna make some modifications. So one question is about, since we're talking about social media platforms, and what kind of a responsibility do you think that media platforms actually hold? Like, what should they do? Or it's clearly debunking misinformation is not what you're promoting here. But then a related question is that then how would you panelists see the relationship between the structural changes of modernity and late capitalism and the contemporary social and the political salience of conspiracy theories? I'm particularly thinking of the relationship between the economic imperatives of capital to smooth over contradictions, which may make individuals more willing to accept the conspiracy theories, and the disenchantment of the world making conspiracy theories solace they may provide, perhaps more appealing. So you can pick either one or just address both, since we're pressed for time. Who would like to go first?
Well, I think the role of the social media platforms are a very fascinating one and a very complex one. So I think also, what they've been doing is avoiding responsibility for a long time and minimizing their efforts at moderating the contents, because they're not media organizations. They're only platforms. And this has really changed over the corona pandemic, I think, and this poses a lot of questions from a democratic perspective. So they are removing all kinds of content that was not aligning with WHO guidelines. And the fact is that we have very little public accountability or ways of seeing what they're doing actually. And also the consequences of it. So in my research on conspiracy theories, you see that they find all kinds of ways to circumvent these regulations that they have been put into practice, or move to alternative platforms. So I think the study of what actually happens when they are performing these forms of content moderation is an interesting one. But you can also ask the question, what exactly is the problem of fake news? Is it the fact, and social media platforms, is it the fact that problematic content is being shared, or that it reaches massive amounts of audiences? So we can think of a way to change these information infrastructures without sort of influencing free speech or public debate, or removing items that are seen as untruthful, etc. But to think of the dynamics of social media that are maybe problematic in terms of reaching massive audiences with like incredible speeds.
I think we should be careful about linking these issues of fake news and conspiracy theories to any particular economic order. I say that because I am reading quite a wonderful book called Humor and Rumor in the Post-Soviet Authoritarian State, which is about Belarus. I'm partly Belarusian, or not that my grandparents would ever admit that, being Jewish and forced to leave in the pogroms, but it's quite a wonderful book by Anastasia Astapova. And she is talking about many of the same issues that we have talked about here in a post-socialist state, whether we will consider Russia and its dependent states as being socialist or being some kind of crony capitalist, I guess would be a matter of some discussion. For me, as someone who believes in, someone who's suspicious of people defining what is true and what is not, I would prefer to see the internet and social media platforms as being like the telephone. That is, it is a means of communication rather than having Bell Telephone listening into the calls and saying, you can't speak on the phone because you're saying the wrong thing. Maybe this is dating back to my, early internet days when the internet was going to be a free space. But, I guess I still have a certain nostalgia for that belief.
I mean, I think in some respects, content moderation is tricky because of the cultural complexities of mis and disinformation. In my research paper on reopen groups, I demonstrate how they repeatedly use Dr. Fauci's advice on 60 Minutes during the pandemic to say that masks weren't effective, because at the very beginning of the pandemic, Dr. Fauci didn't think masks were effective, and it required, ongoing shifts in advice. And so, and because these are Western corporations that are trying to create uniform content moderation standards across all continents, it's impossible, and that's not to say I don't think there shouldn't be some. I think the difference, I guess, between the Bell systems and something like Google or Facebook is that it can connect to so many. We saw January 6th, right? We saw an attempted insurrection on the Capitol of the United States that was fueled by lies, that the election was stolen and this content was spread. And I guess the other thing is they used the platforms to organize these events, and they weren't obvious, right? So there was a ton of organizing happening in reopen groups that were initially devoted to COVID protocols that then became these hotbeds for organizing around January 6th insurrectionists. So I think it's a very, very complicated, unfortunately. And I think in regards to that last question you posted about is fake news a cost of free speech? I mean, I think the notion of free speech, the thing about free speech is that it's a guaranteed aspect of the United States that's bound to public settings. And what we forget is that Twitter and Facebook are private corporations. And so I think even though they like to pretend that they're the new public sphere, they aren't. And so I don't think necessarily protecting the rights of free speech infringes on someone's right to spread falsities in places that aren't bound to service agreements. So that's how I would answer that one.
Right. I mean, it is this revenge, unintended consequences of conservatives saying, let business be free. Well, now business is free. And, conservatives are saying, well, why us? So I think that, and I also think that the issue of lies is something that we cultural sociologists need to engage with, as something other than this rhetorical slap in the face that we will use to those that we disagree with. There are mistaken beliefs, there are hypotheses, and then there are deliberate falsehoods. So I think we need to be a little cautious about that.
So Jaron, what do you think of the relations between free speech and fake news?
Yeah, so from a European context, this is also very different. We don't have a sense of unlimited free speech. We think of freedom in bounded ways in any way. So there's not an unlimited amount of free speech. And I think this is this boundary work of where do we put the limits of free speech, I think is a very relevant one, and also a very culturally dependent one. So the invoking this argument of you're limiting my free speech is less of an issue, I think, in Europe than in the US. I forgot the other thing that I wanted to say about these
but
platforms.
Jaron, the question is, these are American companies who are restricting the freedom of speech of people in Belgium and the Netherlands. So does that matter?
Well, it matters very much that we have it matters very much that we have very little accountability, and that we have very little control over how they designate what is true and what is false, what are the limits of free speech. So normally in a public sphere, we have democratic values that are guiding these dimensions of free speech. And here we have private companies delineating free speech in very inconsistent ways. A lot of propaganda from certain actors is allowed, while a lot of other free speech that doesn't align with the ideology and the commercial interests, perhaps, of these platforms is allowed. So it's also, there is no consistency in the content moderations they're performing. You see that especially in different national contexts, where during the corona pandemic, a lot of respected mainstream newspapers in Holland got banned from Twitter or from Facebook, and it took a while before they got back on track again. So the whole complexity of so now they installed this board of oversight on Facebook, etc. But still, it's very unclear. They're intransparent. They're not working with researchers in terms of showing how they are doing this. So to hold these commercial companies just as accountable for their information as we do with media companies in Europe, at least, there's all kinds of media laws that don't apply to these commercial companies. And I think this is definitely something that is happening in Europe, and that the US is very resistant to, of holding these commercial platforms accountable as media companies.
So I guess that brings into the sort of cross-national comparative perspective, which I think cultural sociologists could contribute to. Okay, so before we end today's panel, I would like to invite all the panelists to offer just a few concluding remarks. Okay, let's see. Francesca, do you want to go first?
Sure. I guess I'd just like to say thank you. This was a really fun conversation. I think it provides us an opportunity to think more about how cultural sociology has something to say when it comes to misinformation environments and the role technology plays in spreading these systems. And I guess I would just encourage us to encourage more conversation within our field, but also think about cross interdisciplinary approaches to studying these problems as well.
Okay. Jaron?
Yeah, I fully endorse that. I think you see a lot of research on fake news, disinformation being dominated by cognitive sciences and behaviorism. And I think we as cultural sociologists definitely need to team up with the computer scientists because the psychologists did that very much. And I think we sort of refrained from that, or it's also more difficult, I think, to connect cultural sociology and cultural dynamics with information science, data science, especially because they're very built on the psychometrics, especially how the platforms are operating, using psychological profiling instead of a cultural profiling that they do much less. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to turn that balance a bit more to cultural understandings of information dynamics in the digital age.
Okay. Gary?
Well, I want to conclude by channeling one of the great sociologists of the 20th century, Robert Merton. And Robert Merton reminded us sociologists of the importance of studying the unintended consequences. And I think a number of the things that we have discussed today about media, corporations and social media and belief structures and communities all play into this question of what are the downstream effects of the policies and the beliefs that we have in contemporary life. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so very much for speaking on such a difficult and complex topic, and thank you to all of you for coming. Next time, our panel will be about the national crisis of masculinity in May, I think. Yes. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everybody, and thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.